He stood by the tattered flagpole, his hand trembling against the fabric that once carried his pride. The same flag he bled for now waved above a town that didn't know his name. Once, he'd charged into cannon fire for the promise stitched in its stars. Now, folks crossed the street to avoid his shadow. His metals had rusted, his horse long gone, but the memories burned brighter than ever. "I fought for this flag," he whispered, eyes wet with dust and years, "and it forgot my name." Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Elias Crane came to Drive Creek like a rumor, soft, persistent, the kind of story folks pretended not to hear. The town had sprouted new porches and painted shutters since his last march, a telegraph wire humming over Main Street like a second indifferent horizon, and he felt each change in the tread of his soles as if the land itself had shifted beneath him. Unfamiliar and deliberate, he moved with a slow, measured gait because his knees remembered the long miles of saddle and the hush of bivouac, because his hands remembered the weight of a saber and the heavier weight of names that would not leave him, because his chest was a ledger of aches and promises unpaid. And when he reached the square, the flagpole rose where it had always risen, plain wood, sun-faded rope, and the flag above it was bright and clean, snapping in the wind as if freshly ironed, as if the cloth could wash away what it had once mended. And Elias placed his fingers on that fabric the way a man lays his palm on an old scar to test whether it still hurts. The banner had once been a map of blood and hope, stitched with faces and vows. Now it was a lacquered emblem that shone for parades and speeches, not for the man who'd fallen beneath it. Children ran past with sticky hands and laughter that struck him like a bell tolling for a stranger. Merchants tipped their hats without recognition, and a pair of women crossed the street to give him more room than courtesy required. He felt the sharper wound of invisibility more than the stubborn throb in his shoulder. Victories remembered in brass plaques and town names, but the men who bought those victories with sweat and bone left unspoken, their letters unread, their graves listed only in the brittle rolls of old regiments in dusty offices. Elias thought of the long nights when stars were the only witness and of the way a man's name can vanish like smoke when there is no one left to speak it, and he tasted the iron of memory on his tongue like the rust of metals he kept under a pillow. Metals that had lost their shine but not their culpability, for honor that needs an audience is only costume, and he had none. A breeze lifted the banner and for a moment he saw, not the neat embroidery of the modern town, but the flash of sabers, the thunder of hooves, the silhouette of a boy who had called him sergeant and whose name had been pressed into Elias's palm with dying breath, a small fist that had made a promise. "Remember us," he had said, "remember us." And Elias had carried that promise like a stone in his chest ever since. Yet here, beneath this very cloth, people strolled and argued about commerce and the weather, and the names slept unspoken like seeds buried too deep to sprout, and the ache in Elias's heart made him speak aloud though he had no audience. "I fought for this flag," he said, not to anger, not yet to plead, but to cause the old syllables to rise and be counted, and his voice was a dry leaf against the square's laughter, and he realized, with a righteous, terrible clarity, that the country could hold the shape of its pride without holding the men who gave it meaning, that flags could fly and forget, and his chest tightened until memory itself felt like a covenant breaking, and he stood there, coat threadbare, medals hidden, a man who had been witness to fire, hands clenched around the fabric that had once been a promise, listening to Dry Creek summon, knowing in the raw places of himself that if he did nothing, the silence would finally swallow the names he kept alive. Elias drifted down Dry Creek's main street like a man walking through the margin of his own life, each footfall a small, stubborn proof that he had not yet been erased. Telegraph poles stitched the horizon with wire, and the town's new carriages shimmered with iron and varnish, carrying men and women who had never smelled the bitter tang of gunpowder, whose hands had not learned the particular tenderness of bandaging a friend's jaw, whose faces were smooth and unscarred and unknowhere, and Elias felt the distance between them like a draft under a door. His coat, once taut with pride, hung on him like a memory. The brass insignia at his throat had lost its polish but not its story. He ran a thumb over the worn crescent and let the touch sink in like a benediction. then looked up to see a saloon whose sign promised warmth and ale, and found that the barkeep's eyes slid past him as if politeness were a currency Elias no longer carried. When he pushed the batwing door, the room smelled of tobacco and laughter. But when he announced himself, old uniform, steady voice, the man behind the bar checked his glass, checked Elias's empty palm, and shook his head, a motion as small and final as a closing ledger. "Can't serve you, old-timer," the barkeeper said without malice, as if misfortune were a natural awe. He turned to the smithy for work, muscle, a day's wage, the honest trade he'd always known, and the blacksmith, who had been apprenticed to no soldier's memory, looked at his hands on the ragged cuff and said the line that cut like cold iron, "We don't need help, we can't pay." So Elias walked on, the town's commerce passing him by like a river current that would not change course to carry him. Children darted between wagons, their shouts bright and ignorant, and an elderly woman tightened her shawl as he passed by, crossing the street as though proximity might rub a hole in the comfortable tapestry of her life. Each glance sampled him and discarded him. Honor, he discovered, is a fragile thing. The townsfolk could hang a flag and speak of noble causes and parades, while the men who had bloodied the earth beneath that cloth were left to rust in corners. Memory, he realized, required tending, and Dry Creek had foregone the work of remembrance in favor of progress and tidy histories. That evening the sky boiled with orange and iron as the sun slid behind distant ridges, and Elias found himself pulled to the river that bordered the town as if some old law of his bones insisted on the water's witness. He lay down on the bank where cattails whispered and the flag at the square snapped faintly on the wind like a wounded bird reaching for altitude, and he pulled his knees up and hugged them as if they might hold together what the world had loosened. He thought of names, young names, voices once close, and of a boy who'd gripped his sleeve in the night and whispered, "Sergeant, remember us," the words simple as bread and impossible to dine on now that faces had left his memory like seasons. Elias wrapped his coat around himself, not for warmth so much as for shape. He liked to be a man with edges, not a rumor. He let the flag's distant flutter be his lullaby and the telegraph's faint clicks like a second heartbeat, and he promised quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, that he would not vanish into the town's neat margins without testing whether the people who raised banners could still tell the names those banners had cost. Tomorrow he would try to teach, to prod the sleepy civic memory awake. But tonight he sat with the river in the sky and the tired flag and felt the truth like a stone settle in his chest. Being known, he thought, is an act of others, and if others will not act, remembrance becomes a duty one must perform alone. Night fell like a curtain he could not lift, and Elias tumbled into sleep with a raw, exhausted heaviness that only a life of marshes can teach a man, and the dream found him quickened without mercy. Smoke rolled low and thick, a living ocean swallowing horizon and boot, and the air itself tasted of iron and ash. The ground beneath him thundered with hoof and boot, a relentless percussion that matched the drumbeat in his chest, and flashes, too bright and wrong, punctured the sky like white knives. He was there again, shoulder to shoulder with boys who smelled of fear and tobacco, faces young as prayer, voices thin as thread, and among them Harlan, small-voiced and fierce, who grinned with mud on his teeth and held the flag so close his fingers bled into the cloth, whispering, "Don't let them forget us, Sergeant," words that, in the dream, landed like a command and a benediction at once. The thunder around them folded into a chorus of names, names Elias could almost see on the backs of men's necks, on the wind that braided their hair, and each name felt like an ember he must keep alive. The battlefield was a cathedral of noise. Orders snapped like brittle branches. Men cried and laughed in the same breath. Horses screamed, and the flag, torn and filthy, became a lighthouse in that hurricane, its polis bind to lean on, its colors a promise stitched with blood. Elias ran with the line though his legs were not his own in the dream, and he felt the old certainty of purpose rise inside him like steam. The clean, terrible clarity of a man whose only job was to keep the wounded from being swallowed by oblivion. He woke with a start, lungs heaving as if the dream's smoke had followed him into the room, sweat cooling on his skin like a second rhyme. For a moment he lay in the dark and let the boy's words echo, "Don't let them forget us," until the phrase became a drumbeat, a vow, something that pushed at the marrow of his bones. He tasted the memory of Harlan's small brown hand in his palm, the weight of it like a promise made in the dark, and guilt rose sharp and honest inside him because the world he'd returned to had traded memory for clean streets and neat histories, and the men who had given everything were reduced to lines in a ledger no one read aloud. Elias sat up, the room around him hollow and quieter than the battlefield ever had been, and he found himself repeating the names: Harlan, McKee, Thomas, first like confession, then like prayer, then like a roll call meant to keep ghosts away. He pressed his forehead to his knees and thought of how easy it is for towns to hang flags and forget the hands that sewed them, how simple it is to frame triumph and frame out the cost, and his chest tightened until remembrance felt like a physical ache that required tending. The promise in Harlan's dying whisper burned now with the heat of duty. Elias would not let those names become wind-carried dust. He rose before dawn with the stubbornness of a man who has chosen a task he cannot abandon, and the river's glassy face greeted him like a question. "Will you do it, old soldier?" He answered not with words but with motion, cleaning his coat, folding the ragged flag he kept against his heart, etching the faces of the lost into the soft wood of his cuff with his thumb until the grain held them, and in the thin light of morning he swore, with the private ferocity of a man who has loved and lost too much to be silent, that he would haul those names from the dark and lay them on Dry Creek's tongue until the town could not walk past the flagpole without hearing them. Dawn found Elias half buried in the long grass beside a dirt track that led to a low, weathered homestead. He had walked until his legs faltered and the sun hung low and merciless, and there, as if the earth itself had decided to be merciful at last, Martha Calloway appeared with a pitcher and a basket, her apron mottled with flour and thyme, and when she saw him she did not hurry or shout or turn away. She moved as if kindness were a muscle she had exercised every day of widowhood, and she lifted him with an ease that surprised him, set him on a chair by her hearth, and fed him broth that tasted of carrot and bone in the patient seasons of a woman who had learned to stitch grief into the grain of daily life. Elias felt, in the simplest tacks, her folded napkin, the way she poured water over his hands, the small, unwavering attention to the minute details of another human's discomfort, that here was a place where memory might be kept alive not with grand gestures but with steady care. And when he tried to speak of the war at first his voice came out like gravel, halting, as if the sound of those years had to rouse itself from sleep, and Martha listened in the way a well listens when you drop a pebble into it, quiet, unhurried, letting the ripples spread without comment. He told her of smoky night watches, of horses that had died with their bridles broken and of boys whose teeth gleamed in the mud, of a flag that had been more a promise than a piece of cloth. And his stories came not as boasts but as ledger entries of sorrow he could no longer keep folded in the dark. And she did not ask for proof or parade or disbelief. She only reached across the table and pressed a cool hand to his knuckles as if to anchor him to the present, and the gesture steadied him more than any compliment could have. Then, in the quiet between sentences, Martha's voice, soft and rusty like a bell in long winter, offered her own confession. Her husband had not come home from that same war. She had kept his cap on a peg and his plate in a cabinet and his chair at the table like a small shrine. And though neighbors had given her neighbors versions of the end, buried somewhere, listed as missing, a footnote in her regiment's roll, she had never known the company he'd kept or the name of the officer who'd led him that last day. She had lived on questions, on the thin thread of hope that some letter might reroute her life into closure, and Elias listened as the name slipped from her lips in an offhand way. Thomas Calloway, a syllable that landed in his chest with the weight of a spent ball. For a second the room held its breath and the soup steam seemed to freeze in the sunbeam, and memories thudded into place like pieces of a map he had kept folded in the pocket of his coat. Thomas lying against a splintered fence, the mud in his hair, the small voice that asked for water, the way Elias had pressed a coin into a dead hand and promised to tell the widow whatever lay within his failing memory. Guilt, immediate and hot, rose in Elias like bile, for he had carried that secret like contraband. He had been the man who had watched Thomas breathe his last and had learned the names of the dead by the sound of them in the dark, but he had never cross-stitched his confession into the fabric of civilian life. He had been a keeper of names in the privacy of his own silence, fearful that telling would be pretending to claim a debt he could never repay, or that the truth would be too heavy for a widow to bear. So he bent his head and swallowed the confession back down, tasting its sacredness, and instead he spoke of Thomas in the roundabout way of a man who tries to return alone without admitting ownership, praising the soldier's steady hands and the way he whistled at dawn, careful not to say he had seen the black of those eyes close for the final time. Martha's tears came slow and bright, not from shock but from a gratitude that was both fierce and weary, and she thanked him simply for speaking as if the bare fact of being spoken to might be a balm. And Elias, who had come to Dry Creek to make the dead remembered, left the table with the knowledge that remembering meant more than monuments. It meant honesty, and yet he walked away with his secret still clasped in his fist because some debts, he told himself, must be delivered at the right hour. And he feared that spilling the whole truth might shatter the fragile peace Martha had rebuilt around herself. So he chose for now to tend the wound with quiet watchfulness, to stand guard over the widow's evenings and to keep the names circling in his head like lanterns ready to be lit when the town would hold them up to see. The rumor of Elias Crane's presence threaded through Dry Creek like the cheap gossip it was meant to be, and by midweek the town had decided what he would be: eccentric, pitiable, maybe dangerous, certainly a curiosity. The widow's kitchen, which had been a quiet refuge for weary souls, became a stumbling point for whispers, and children's fingers pointed a little straighter when they passed the porch where he sat, as if pointing could pin a man to a single definition and keep the rest safe from inquiry. Some laughed in the tavern at the notion of an old cavalryman haunting Main Street as if he were a relic on display, and one or two men swapped exaggerated tales of his supposed exploits until the truth was a soup of rumor seasoned by bravado. And others, more dander, left a bowl of stew on Martha's step with hands that trembled when they retreated. Pity offered like coin, a small, awkward charity that avoided eye contact. The sheriff, a broad-faced man named Briggs who believed that peace required tidy histories, came by with a hat in his hand and a voice that meant to sound brotherly but landed like a reprimand. Don't go stirring up the past, Elias. Folks like their memories neat. You make trouble with old ghosts, you'll only make trouble for yourself. It was not a command so much as a civic prayer, that the town might sleep without wrestling its conscience into the daylight, and Elias felt the town's caution press against his ribs like a cold hand. The schoolhouse, newly painted and smelling faintly of lime and chalk, raised its own flag each morning, brilliant and unmarred, and the teacher, Miss Langley, a practical woman with spectacles and an inflexible faith in progress, spoke of lessons and arithmetic and the town's bright future. When Elias, who had begun to offer himself as a living ledger of memory, tried to tell one of the children about the weight of the flag and the men beneath it, she smiled the way people smile when they mean to comfort and then steer back to safer shoals. History, she said once, with the bluntness of ledger entries, is what's in the books, Mr. Crane. We teach facts so the town can move on. Her words were not cruel. They had the clean edge of utility, as if remembrance were a function to be optimized rather than a duty to be borne. Elias watched the bright banner above the school crisp and commanding in the wind and felt it strip away layers of blood and consequence until the fabric was only a symbol of civic pride, a thing that could be polished and hung for festivals without carrying the grit of funerals. When he spoke of the muddy, ragged flags he had known, torn at the hems, red with the earth that had swallowed friends, people changed the subject to the harvest or the telegraph's arrival or the county fair, and in those small evasions the war's edges dulled. Memory, he realized with a bitter, physical clarity, is a muscle that must be exercised. Dry Creek had chosen forgetfulness not as malice but as convenience, and convenience can be its own cruelty. At the post office the clerk folded a letter over twice before he handed it to Elias, as if the act of touching an old soldier might soil the paper. At the Mercantile a widow traded gossip for sugar and kept her chin up while avoiding the man who had been the nearest thing the nation had to her husband's witness. And in the square, under the very pole he had first gripped when he arrived, men set up a ribbon cutting for a telegraph line with speeches about progress and unity while Elias stood to the side and held his coat closed against the wind, feeling smaller than the smallest ribbon. That night, as the town settled into its polite sleep and the flag at the schoolhouse hung like a promise untested, Elias paced the edges of his own patience and thought of the boys who had once called him Sergeant, boys whose faces were beginning to blur at the edges because no one called those names aloud anymore. And he understood, with the same dreadful logic a man uses to read a wound, that forgetting had become a form of survival here, yet survival for some meant erasure for others, and Elias, who had come to keep fire with the same stubbornness he had kept land in battle, knew he could not let memory be a thing they shelved like a broken tool. He pressed his palm to the flag in the dark as if to check that it was real and swore beneath his breath that if the town would not remember by choice, then he would remind them by will, softly, stubbornly. until even the polite turned their heads to listen. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. It was near the edge of afternoon, when the schoolhouse bell had stopped ringing and the dust from children's shoes still floated in the golden light, that the boy appeared. Tom Miller, no more than 10, with hair the color of straw and eyes that held the kind of open wonder the world hadn't yet managed to bruise. And he stood a few feet from Elias Crane, who sat on the bench outside the blacksmith's, oiling the worn leather strap of his satchel like a man tending a relic of faith. Tom had been staring for a while, the way children do when they're balancing curiosity and fear, until finally he spoke, his voice a small note that broke the dry quiet. "Mister, what's it like to fight for a flag?" The question landed like a pebble in Elias's chest, sending out ripples that touched every buried corner of his memory. For a long breath, he didn't answer. He just watched the boy, the raw honesty of that gaze, and something in him softened, a flicker of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Then he smiled, faint but true, and said, "Son, it ain't the flag you fight for. Not really. It's the men beside you, the ones who stand when you can, the ones who bleed the same ground and call it home. The flag's just the cloth that remembers what they did." Tom blinked, as if trying to hold that thought in his hands. "So, it's not about winning?" he asked, and Elias chuckled. "Hello," tired sound that carried both pride and grief. "Winning's just the echo," he said softly. "What matters is the sound it came from." The boy's face lit with the kind of curiosity that refuses to die, and before Elias knew it, there were more children, 3, then 5, then a dozen, hovering around, drawn by the novelty of an old soldier talking like the books never did. They sat in the dirt, knees hugged to chests, eyes bright with the quiet reverence that comes only when listening to someone who has seen the far edge of the world. Elias spoke, not like a man reciting history but like one unburdening his soul. He told them of the dawn fog that crept over campgrounds like ghostly hands, of the smell of horses and fear in the songs men sang before dawn to remind themselves they were still human. He told them about bravery that came in whispers, not shouts, how courage sometimes meant staying still when every instinct told you to run, how hope was in something shining in the sky but something passed between men like a canteen in the desert. The children leaned closer, not blinking, and in their silence Elias felt something rise in him that he had thought long dead, a purpose, steady and pulsing, as if each question the boy asked pumped breath back into the chambers of his heart. "Did you ever get scared?" one girl asked, her voice trembling. Elias's eyes went distant for a heartbeat, then returned with a calm that came only from surviving fear itself. "Every man who says he wasn't is either lying or already dead," he said. "Fear's the proof you're still alive enough to care." The teacher, Miss Langley, had stepped out at some point, watching from the doorway, her arms crossed but her face softening with each word. When the bell rang again, calling the children home, none of them moved. They lingered, reluctant to let the spell break, until Tom finally whispered, "Mister, will you tell us more tomorrow?" Elias nodded, and the boy grinned, running off into the setting sun with the others like sparks from a rekindled fire. Alone again, Elias sat on the bench, the air around him thick with ghosts but lighter somehow, as if the act of remembering aloud had scattered their weight among younger shoulders. He looked at the flag above the schoolhouse, fluttering against the amber sky, and for the first time since the war ended, it didn't look like a symbol of what was lost. It looked like a promise that, through the listening hearts of children, something he fought for might still live. Dawn laid a thin, silver light across the Cowboy fields when Elias and Martha finished knotting the new rail into place, and Martha, who had the steady hands of a woman who'd mended more than shirts, patted his forearm and said as if naming a small truth, "Good to the stones, Elias. Names take root better when someone walks for them." And because she spoke with the simple gravity of daily courage, he nodded and crossed the lane with that particular slowness of a man who must decide with each step whether the past will follow. The cemetery gate creaked in the same half-sad, half-sentimental way it always had, wooden posts leaning like tired sentries, and the air there smelled of turned earth and last night's rain and clipped grass, a scent that carried memory like pollen. He moved among the markers, slabs of granite, splintered wood, letters worn soft by wind and grief, reading the shorthand of lives, a name, a year, a husband, a son, an epitaph meant to be a promise. The stones were patient record keepers, resisting the town's hurry to tidy history into neat pages. And Elias liked that stubbornness in them, the way weather refused to let memory be glossy. He walked slow, touching names with the reverence of a man who believes a name spoken is a living thing. And then his hand stopped, breath gone, because the letters on one stone, deeper, older, carved with the deliberate hand of someone who wanted to be sure, spelled out Thomas Calloway, and above it the rank curved, Captain. The world tightened to the size of that slab. Elias's mouth went dry as river mud and a sound like a shudder came down in his chest. He saw Thomas then in flashes, his sure eyes, the way he'd tucked a stray curl behind his ear before a march, the small joke he made to keep men from thinking of funerals, and remembered the field where the earth had taken so much. Thomas's fingers slipping from his own in the sod, the way his breath had come short and hot, the dusty light like a benediction as Elias leaned close and promised what promises a man can make in the brief corridor between life and death. "Tell her I kept watch," he had said. "Tell her I saw him brave." He had meant to keep that promise. He had meant to write the widow a letter that would be an offering, a small map back to closure. But memory is a treacherous pocket, he thought. Things get folded, lost between rolls and coats, and years had worn on, and the letter had remained a phantom in his satchel, uninked, the edges softened by his thumb as if his hesitation itself had become a rubbing that made the paper thin. Now guilt came at him like weather, sudden, physical, as if the earth under his boots had risen to press him down. He fell to his knees by the marker, gravel cutting his palms, and the graveyard sounds constricted to a single crow and the faraway creak of a wagon. He spoke the name aloud, Thomas Calloway, just once, then again, and the syllables felt like coins dropped into a long-forgotten well. He pressed his forehead to the cool stone and let the memory unspool, the mud in a beard, the heat of a day when men became small beside the immensity of loss, Harlan's whisper in the night asking not to be forgotten, and he felt the weight of all the men he had carried fold into that instant. Tears, stubborn and unexpected, slid down to join the dust on his face. They were not theatrics, but the honest moisture of a man who had hoarded grief until the ledger overflowed. In that kneeling he understood a truth he had been evading. Keeping names locked inside a solitary chest is selfish in its way, for it denies the living the chance to grieve together and the dead the dignity of being spoken for in public. He rose with a new, slow resolve, lighter, not because the guilt vanished, but because he would no longer be its sole keeper. And he smoothed his coat and set his jaw like a man stepping into duty again. He would write the widow. He would tell Martha everything with hands that did not tremble from shame but from eagerness to unburden. And he would take those names back to the children and to the town square until the stones' voices were mirrored in the mouths of the living. The marker stayed where it was, patient as a witness. Elias walked away with the name no longer secret. Cradled now like a lantern, he would carry through Dry Creek until the town learned to see the cost stitched into its flag. The sheriff found Elias like a cloud finds a cliff, slow, inevitable, and with the same quiet force. Briggs came down Main Street in a coat that still smelled faintly of office paper and horse sweat, hat brim low. And when he stopped before the bench where Elias sat, he removed his hat not as courtesy but as a formal preface to bad news. And his voice was the kind that belonged to men who measure trouble in ledger entries. "You're stirring up the past, Crane. Folks don't need." He stopped himself, the rest of the sentence trailing like a cartwheel left in the dust. And Elias looked up, the bench creaking under him like an old memory, and answered not with a plea but with the simple gravity that had carried him through battlefields. "If we forget what we blend for, Briggs, we'll lose it all again." The sheriff's jaw worked, his eyes narrowed in the way of men who equate peace with neatness. "There's a line between honoring and worrying," he said. "You teach children stories of blood and guns, and you make ghosts where there was sleep. This town's built on moving forward, telegraph, trade. We don't need old wounds picked open." His words were not cruel so much as bureaucratic. They were the language of someone for whom stability was a spreadsheet. Elias felt the heat of the sun like an indictment. Memories clustered at the corners of his mouth like embers. "Moving forward's easy when you've forgotten the cost," he said. "There's no forward if you don't remember who paid for the road you walk." Around them folks paused, their daily business a tablet that bent toward the conversation like a cat to the sound of wind. Shopkeepers on stools, children peering from behind curtains, women with laundry over their arms whose hands stilled mid-fold. The sheriff tried then the softer tack, the one public men use when private admonition fails. We respect you, Elias. We do. But you go telling children that dying's noble and they'll grow up to think sacrifice is the only value. That ain't the town I want to raise my boy in. The line landed with the intended thud. Parents nodded, yet Elias saw the fear behind it, an anxiety that remembrance would demand something they had no appetite to pay. Anger, change, the messy work of collective grief. He rose, joints complaining like an old gate, and leaned so close the sheriff could have read his pulse. I'm not teaching them to romanticize death, he said. I'm teaching them the names of men who went before, the things they left behind so those things might mean something. If you call that stirring, then let it be stirred. His voice was low, a kind of honest iron. Miss Langley, who had been watching from the schoolhouse doorway, pressed a hand to her mouth as if to keep herself from speaking. The children clustered beyond her skirt shifted like a flock. Rumors like this are contagious. You could see the town taking inventory of itself. Would it choose ease or truth? Sheriff Briggs, feeling the crowd's attention like draft, answered with the rhetoric of an uneasy mediator. You'll turn people against one another. You'll reopen grief some have closed. I won't have the town torn apart on account of one man's memories. Elias's laugh came out small, bitter. Grief closed is not healed, Briggs. It's a wound bound tight with ignorance. You think you protect folks by sweeping names under new rugs, but those names will snag someone's foot and trip them all the same. The exchange became the town's new weather. People replayed it in kitchens and on porches, and talk of the old soldier and the sheriff's warning swelled into a rumor that held both scorn and sympathy like two coins in one hand. That night, in the square where the flag snapped cleanly above the schoolhouse, Elias walked alone and felt the sheriff's words turn in his mind. He did not expect everyone to thank him. He had been a soldier, not a statesman, but he did expect the town to reckon with its past even if reckoning was a chore. He thought of Harlan's whisper, of Thomas Calloway's stone, of the children's eyes that had asked him to speak again, and he understood the choice he had, to be quiet and let names go dark, or to make noise enough that silence no longer seemed like peace. He could see Briggs's point. Peace was precious, but peace bought with forgetting felt like theft, and Elias, with the stubbornness of a man who had watched too many promises die in the mud, chose to be the one who made noise. The town would talk. Let it. He would teach the names until the gossip turned into memory, and memory into the town's conscience, even if he had to stand against the sheriff himself to do it. The sky over Dry Creek turned the color of old iron that evening, thick with the smell of rain and electricity, and the wind began to move in sudden fits, snapping shutters and kicking dust into wild spirals that clotted the air like restless spirits. The townsfolk, seasoned in drought and blizzards but not in tempests of this kind, shuttered their windows and pulled their children close while the sheriff nailed down what signs he could in the church bell tower once before the wind swallowed its voice whole. Elias Crane stood by the window of Martha Calloway's house, feeling the first drops against the glass like warnings, sharp, insistent, familiar in their rhythm, and when the thunder began its long roll through the hills, something in his bones recognized it, the same dull percussion that once echoed through battlefields and bivouacs. He felt the air pulsate as a drumhead, and for a heartbeat, he was young again, ripping a flagpole in a storm of gunfire, the world tilting under him. Then the gust came, fierce and absolute, tearing shingles, flinging branches like broken spears, and through that chaos he saw it, the flag at the town square snapping in agony, the rope jerking free, the banner twisting loose and carried high into the gray before it vanished into the storm's moor. Martha's voice reached him faintly from the kitchen, warning him not to go, but her words were swallowed by the wind before they reached the part of him that could still listen. Duty, once awakened, knows no argument. He stepped into the rain, coat whipping, boots sinking into the forming rivulets, each step harder than the last, his breath thick with water and old memory. Lightning carved the sky open, white and merciless, illuminating the world in brief, ghostly still frames, the church cross bending, a wagon overturned, the mud rising to claim the street, and then, through the silver downpour, he saw it lying half-buried near the square, the flag muddied and heavy with rain, pressed into the ground as if the storm itself sought to erase it. Elias stumbled toward it, the wind pushing back like an enemy line, his hat long gone, his hands raw from gripping anything that would hold. Thunder crashed again and again, so close it shook the air out of his chest, and the scent of ozone filled his mouth like gunpowder. When he reached the flag, he fell to his knees without ceremony and lifted it, fingers trembling, water and dirt dripping from its stars. It was a ruined thing, torn seams, frayed edge, but alive somehow. Its weight the same as it had been on the field when Harlan's voice had called out behind him, "Don't let them forget us, Sergeant." And Elias could almost hear it now, threading through the gale, not as accusation but as command renewed. The rain lashed at him like shards, plastering his hair to his face. But he clutched that flag the way a drowning man clutches breath, pressing it against his heart until he felt its sodden fabric pulse with his own. Each crack of lightning revealed him, a solitary figure against the riot of weather, a silhouette carved in defiance. And for a moment, Dry Creek's storm was no longer just a storm. It was the echo of the war he had never stopped fighting. The same chaos, the same current, the same loneliness of standing when others fled. When at last the wind began to break and the rain softened from rage to sorrow, Elias tied the flag to his walking staff, binding it tight with rope and resolve, and began the slow march home through the flooded streets. His clothes clung to him like second skin, his boots filled with water, but the flag, though battered, lifted behind him, fluttering weakly against the storm's dying breath, a wounded but unyielding ghost. By the time he reached Martha's porch, she was waiting with a lantern, her eyes wide not with surprise but with recognition. She had seen that look in men once, long ago, the look of those who would face down hell and come back carrying something worth saving. He stood there dripping and trembling, flag still clenched in his hand, and for a long while neither spoke. The thunder rumbled once more in the distance, low and fading, and Elias, breath ragged, whispered to the night as much as to her, "No flag belongs in the dirt." Then, with the reverence of prayer, he leaned the staff by the fire, and the flag, torn, soaked, and shining faintly in the lantern glow, hung like a survivor refusing to fall. Martha found Elias by the kitchen hearth where the fire painted the room in slow gold, and he sat hunched over the sodden flag like a man mending a wound, hands moving with the careful reverence of someone who has handled more fragile things than cloth. The flag's stars were dim with mud and smoke streaked, and Elias worked silently, folding, patting, laying it flat across his knees as if the act itself might press memories back into order. And when she crossed the floor, she did not startle or scold, but simply set a kettle to sing and put 2 clean mugs on the table, small domestic liturgies that made the room safe for truth. He had been repairing the banner all evening, the fabric whispering under his fingers, and the lines of his face were carved deeper by the storm and by the confession he carried like contraband. And Martha, who had lived long enough to know that some grief must be tended like a slow fire, watched him with the steady, unshocked patience of a woman who had kept a chair for a man who never returned. For a long time neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft ticking of a clock and the flag's damp breath settling into the folds. And then Elias, who had rehearsed the words a dozen ways in the hollow of his head and found them always too heavy, finally lifted his eyes to hers and spoke not with the soldier's clipped cadence but with the small, brittle honesty of a man laying down what he'd carried too long. "Martha, you're Thomas. He died under my watch." The sentence landed like a stone and the room held its breath. Martha's hands stilled on the mug she had been wiping, the cloth folding in her palms like a small, obedient thing, and she did not scream or demand proof. Instead, her face moved through a geometry of grief, shock, and immediate, tender recognition, then a weary patience. Elias told it in the way of men who have seen the end and must describe it: the march, the ambush, the smoke that hung like a second sky, Thomas's hand slipping from his grasp into mud, the smallness of breath when a man is going. He told the particulars that only witnesses know, the way Thomas had cursed softly at a splinter in his palm, the joke he had made about missing his wife's soup, the promise Elias had made to bring word. He told it without flourish because flourish would have been a disrespect to the dull, absolute terror of dying. And as he spoke, his voice sometimes broke and sometimes found an old, steady cadence that proved the story true. Martha listened as if she were collecting the pieces of a map she had longed for. Sometimes her eyes closed and a single tear tracked a path through flour-dusted skin, and sometimes she let a small, bitter smile pass, half remembered, half grateful, at some detail Elias offered. like the way Thomas had whistled when he walked. When the confession finished, a silence fell that was not empty. It was full of things rearranged into new order, loss given shape, absence named. Martha walked to the hearth and set the mugs down, and then, with the quiet that had held her through years of unanswered letters and neighbors' well-meant guesses, she crossed the room and sat opposite him, close enough that their knees almost touched, and she reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in both of hers. The touch was not accusatory, it was a benediction. "Thank you," she said simply, the words small but like a bridge across the space that had separated them, and Elias felt them as if a door had opened in his chest, air moving through places that had been sealed with guilt. She did not demand where the letter was, nor did she rebuke him for the years of silence. She accepted his truth as one accepts fire, dangerous, cleansing, necessary. Tears came to her eyes, mild and steady, and when she spoke again her voice was both broken and clear. "I needed to know," she said. "I've kept a spoon for him for 20 years and I needed the spoon to have a story." The gratitude in her tone was not relief only. It was a kind of gratitude for being trusted with the burden of truth. Elias, who had expected a storm of reproach or disbelief, felt the confession lift from him like a weight slid off a shelf. His shoulders eased though the memory remained, sharpened but lighter because it had been shared. They sat there as the night stitched itself around the house, Martha's hand warm in his, the flag drying on a chair like a patient animal, and Elias realized that the act of telling, of finally turning a private ledger into a public account, had cleansed something in him that he had not known needed cleansing. The secret that had kept him vigilant and withdrawn loosened its grip and left him raw but capable of being present. Martha's thanks was a small, fierce thing that set a new pattern. He would no longer be the sole guardian of the names. He had offered them to the living, and in that offering found a peace that was not forgetting but making memory possible. And as the embers softened in the heart, Elias felt, with a clarity like sunrise, that his next duty would be outward. Letters written, names spoken aloud, children taught, because confession had opened a road where before there had only been a gate, and he would walk it with less of the burden and more of the steady resolve of a man who had at last told the truth. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The morning of Founders Day came bright and gold, the kind of sky that made the whole of Dry Creek look new again, as if the storm had washed the town clean but left the soil of its memory damp and waiting. And when young Tom Miller arrived at Martha Calloway's porch with his hair slicked back and a face shining with the earnest pride of invitation, Elias Crane felt something stir in him that hadn't moved for years, a tremor of belonging. The boy held out an envelope smudged by his own fingers, an official note from Miss Langley asking if Elias would speak at the school ceremony. And though his first instinct was to decline, because what right had he to preach after so many silences, he found himself nodding, quietly, the words forming with the unshakable authority of promise, "Tell her I'll come." By midday, the square was trimmed with bunting, flags new and old, bright against the washed sky, and the townsfolk gathered with their usual mixture of duty and curiosity. But when Elias appeared, walking slow beside Tom and carrying the mended flag from the storm folded in his arms like a relic, the whispers fell away. Even Sheriff Briggs, standing at the edge of the crowd, removed his hat. The schoolhouse doors were thrown open. The children lined up in neat rows, their faces a gallery of curiosity, and Miss Langley gave the briefest of introductions, a man who fought for the land we stand on, before stepping aside. Elias stood before them all, the patched flag heavy in his hands, and for a moment the sight of so many young faces, the future, unbloodied, unscarred, made his voice catch. The words he had prepared scattered like dry leaves, and what came instead was raw, unpolished truth. "This cloth," he began, his tone low, steady, every syllable carrying the rasp of wind through old canyons, "doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the ones who blend beneath it." The silence that followed was deep, not out of confusion but reverence, as though the room itself understood something holy had been said. Elias's eyes traveled over them, children, parents, townsfolk, and he saw tears he hadn't expected, even on the faces of men who had scoffed at him in saloons. "It's not a piece of pride," he continued, lifting the flag slightly so the sunlight struck its mended seams. "It's a piece of remembrance. It's been torn, stained, and carried through hell, and still it flies, not because it's perfect, but because it was lifted by hands that believed in something greater than themselves. He paused, breath shaking, the air trembling around him with quiet attention. Your books might tell you wars are about borders or politics, but they're not. They're about people. Boys no older than you. He nodded toward Tom, who gave their names to the dirt so that others might have the chance to grow old and forget. And forgetting is the easiest in this land ever learned. A murmur of movement rippled through the crowd, a father taking off his hat, a mother pressing her hand to her mouth, the sheriff bowing his head as if suddenly remembering someone's grave. Elias went on, his words flowing now like water released from a dam. I fought for this flag. I watched men fall for it. I watched it soaked in rain and blood, and still I carried it, because it wasn't a symbol of power. It was a promise that no sacrifice would be wasted, no name would be erased. His gaze swept across the crowd and settled on Martha near the back, her eyes bright with pride and quiet sorrow. But promises, he said softly, die when people stop keeping them. The line hit like thunder, echoing in the wooden rafters. Even the children seemed to understand something beyond their years. He lowered the flag then, unfolding it slow, letting the patched fabric stretch open in his hands, and the light from the windows caught on every stitch Martha had made, every tear the storm had left, and in that moment it didn't look like a remnant. It looked like a resurrection. This, he whispered, isn't mine alone anymore. It's yours now. When he stepped back, the silence held a heartbeat longer, then applause rose, not the rowdy, thoughtless kind, but a slow, gathering storm of sound, steady and sincere. Miss Langley wiped her eyes. Sheriff Briggs nodded once, as if conceding something vital. And Tom, the boy who had first asked why, stood the tallest, his hand on his chest, eyes shining. Elias bowed his head, his heart unclenching after years of duty and grief, and for the first time since the war, he felt he had come home, not to a place, but to purpose reborn. Night arrived with a smell of smoke already in the air, a thin, acrid sting that made people step out of their houses and point at the schoolhouse where a single orange tongue had begun to lick the eaves. And in minutes the small building, so recently scrubbed and ribboned for Founders' Day, was a roar of flame, windows glowing like eyes, the roof collapsing in black ribbons. No one could say at first whether it was accident or spied. Mrs. Pryor swore she saw a lantern fall near the back door. Old Mr. Henley swore he glimpsed a figure cross the yard and vanish into the night, and such arguments would bloom later in porches and at the bar. But at the moment there was only the bright, ferocious clarity of danger and the town's hurried, helpless choreography of buckets and shouts. Elias Crane heard the cry in the bell and felt a cold line run down his spine that was older and sharper than fear. It was recognition, the muscle memory of smoke and panic and a duty that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with what you could save when the world was being taken apart. He ran before he thought, boots thudding through mud and splintered boards, the air thick with soot and the heat like a living thing pushing at his face. And when he pushed through the smoke-choked doorway, the building was a cathedral of falling ash, and the flag that had hung above the chalkboard was a dark shape against a lighter inferno, its lower edges singed and curling as if paper might have more claim on flame than meaning. Inside, the floor pitched inside underfoot, the chalkboard's letters boiled and blackened, a child's neatly printed alphabet winking out like small stars, a scream somewhere to the left, someone's coat catching, someone stumbling, sent a new current through the room. But Elias kept his head down and his hands steady, moving toward the tattered banner as if the very ground had been redesigned to final him to it. He thought not of medals or parades but of the boy Harlan and of Thomas Calloway's last whisper, and the memory arranged itself into a single instruction: get the cloth. He reached up with fingers already blistered by years of work and battle and tugged at the rope, but the bracket sizzled and gave, and the flag began to fall like a wounded bird, heavy and hissing. Instinct took him then. He clutched the fabric to his chest, the burned threads biting his palms, the damp heat pressing against his face, and he stumbled back through the choking air, coughing so hard his ears rang, carrying that smoldering piece of meaning like a small, defiant heart. The doorway was a furnace and the world beyond it a ring of faces, lanterns, mouths, hands with buckets halted in midair, and as alive submerged, coughing and black-faced, holding the flag pressed to him as if it were a baby. The square grew so quiet it was almost obscene, a silence that hung like a held breath. People watched with the peculiar, awful mix of admiration and helplessness that comes with seeing a man risk everything for something others will not risk. And Sheriff Briggs, who had argued with him only days before, stood with his hat in his hands and did not move to stop him. Elias collapsed on the wet grass near Martha's porch, flag clutched to his ribs, soot streaking his face into maple-like lines, and for a long moment the world reduced to the sound of his own coughing and the crackle of the dying blaze reflected against the upturned faces. Someone, Tom, perhaps, or Miss Langley, rushed forward with a blanket, hands fumbling, while Martha came out with a lantern and a steadiness that steadied the rest. And when she took the smoking cloth from him, she did not scold or cry, but simply began to pat it and fold it as if handling a hurt animal. And Elias watched through the tremor of heat and wet and felt something shift inside him. The town had seen what he had always said the flag was, something born by human hands and therefore worth saving even from madness and flame. The next hours were a blur of water and tidy grief, someone covering the blackened chalkboard with a sheet, a small boy shaking too hard to speak, neighbors helpfully passing buckets while others argued about blame. But the image that sat in people's minds would not be the ruin so much as Elias, soot-streaked and stubborn, with the flag wrapped to his chest, staggering toward Martha's door. That single defiant act moved the town's conversation, softened the sheriff's hardness, and made the rumor of the crazy old soldier into something larger and less contemptible, a man who remembered when everyone else preferred to forget. The world contracted to a few small facts: the rasp of his breath, the damp smear of soot on his lips, the weight of the flag held hard to his chest, and the faces around him that blurred and sharpened like pages of a book he had read too often. Elias felt his knees buckle as if the marrow itself had decided it would no longer hold him upright. And when he hit the wet grass, the impact was both a relief and a reckoning, a soft surrender after years of standing. Hands, some sure, some fumbling, found him. Tom's small, panicked fingers at his sleeve, Martha's steady palm at his shoulder, the sheriff's rough hand checking a pulse that faltered like a candle in wind, and the town drew close in a ring of lamps and whispered prayers, not yet certain whether this was the end or simply another bruise to be bandaged. Smoke had stained his lungs like an old photograph, and every inhale tasted of iron and rain. But through that acrid veil a certain clarity came, precise and merciful. He could see the constellations above as they had been in marches and watches long ago, though now the stars felt nearer, kinder, as if the same heavens that had guided him through cannons and cold were leaning down to read the name held in his tired hands. He thought of the boys who had once marched at his shoulder and felt the names rise inside him, one by one, like lanterns he could pass along. Harlan's grin, Thomas's steady breath, Mickey's stubborn whistle, names he had kept like contraband. Names he had meant to send home in folded lines of ink, but he instead kept in a hollow of his chest until they had become the marrow of his sorrow. The pain cut and gathered. Each breath was a ledger entry of injuries old and new. But beyond the ache there was a thin thread of triumph. These were not the last moments of a man who had given up, but the first moments of a legacy finally being made public. He pressed the flag closer as if that fabric could stitch his heart back together. And in the chant of voices around him he heard pieces of what he'd hoped for. Someone saying a name aloud, a child repeating a word he'd taught them, a woman whispering thanks for saving something they all took for granted until it nearly burned away. Now they'll remember, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone. The sentence soft as a benediction, and the words came out steady, a bell that might not ring long but would ring true. Memories had weight, he realized, and to set them down in the town square was to make them heavier than gossip, to lay them as stones that would not wash away when drought or convenience passed through. His eyes, half-lidded, found Martha's, and in that look he did not find reproach, but in exchange, she had received his truth and turned it into grace. Tom stood like a sentinel, face streaked with soot and awe, and the sheriff, who had warned him against stirring ghosts, now looked at Elias not as a nuisance but as a kind of conscience made flesh. And the crowd that had scoffed and shuffled now leaned forward, as if wanting to learn how to hold a sorrow without it breaking them. Elias's fingers loosened a little, the flag fluttering against his palm like a tired bird, and the fierce, paternal bent that had kept him upright through years of march and night watch finally eased. He thought, with a soldier's economy, of the last favors man could ask of those left behind: tell our names, keep our faces, teach the children not to cleanse history but to carry it. His breath slowed, each intake a softer negotiation with the dark, and he let his head fall back to the grass to watch the same stars he'd once navigated by, noticing how big and indifferent and, paradoxically, intimate they felt. The hush around him became a kind of cathedral, and he felt the curtains of life draw close with a gentle finality. He smiled then, that then, private smile of men who have done what they could and who, at last, can trust that someone will do the rest. And with the flag held to his heart and the names he loved gathering like embers in the town's mouths, his hand relaxed and fell away, and the silence felt less like an ending and more like the first quiet after a bell had tolled and been heard. Dawn came slow and honest, and Dry Creek gathered as if to witness the accounting of a town's conscience. Men with tucked hats, women with hands still marked by the night's labor, children clinging to small badges of courage they had not yet named, all forming a humble ring around the blackened bones of the schoolhouse where learning had once begun and where, the night before, a man had given everything to keep a promise. The air tasted of ashen rain and something like repentance, and the silence felt like a single held breath that the town was collectively forcing itself to release. Sheriff Briggs stood not at the edge this time but among the crowd, shoulders bent in a way that squeezed out whatever easy pride he had carried for office. And when he lowered his head, it was not the performative gesture of a man who shields himself with authority, but the genuine, slow bow of one who finally understood that his earlier warnings had been small comforts paid for by another's burden. He met Martha's eyes and there were no words between them, only the mutual recognition of the cost of forgetting. Tom, barefoot, soot still smeared on one cheek, hair plastered from the night's water, walked to the grave with the awkward reverence of a child performing an adult task. And in his hands he held the flag that had been Elias's last heartbeat, its fabric cracked and curled where flame had kissed it, the mended seams like a map of the struggle that had brought it home. Tom climbed the low mound and laid the cloth atop the fresh earth, pressing it down as if to root the memory into the soil itself, and then leaned close and whispered, so soft only the ground and the dead could hear, "We'll remember, sir." The words, though a child's, were the kind that make men steady. They traveled small and certain through the crowd like a bell tolling a small, exact truth. Martha wept, but her tears carried the dual weight of sorrow and a strange, grateful relief, and she smiled through them as if what she had waited 20 years for, a scrap of truth that would let grief form into something that could be carried, had finally arrived. She touched the cloth as if to confirm it was real and then laid her hand against the dirt where Elias's head would lie, like a benediction given in ordinary terms. Around them, the town's posture shifted visibly. Those who had once scoffed steeled into a quiet shame. Those who had tossed gossip like harmless stones now folded their arms and bowed their heads, and those who had simply gone about business found themselves unable to keep to petty charge while a man's life and sacrifice lay open before them. The school's burned rafters smoldered like a guilty conscience. The chalkboard, blackened and warped, still bore a ghost of the alphabet children had learned, and its faint letters seemed now less about rote and more like a summons. Teach them names. Conversations began to renege. Neighbors who had circled opinion instead of truth now compared memories, shared small details, handed each other the pieces of a story they had pretended not to know. The saloon keeper placed a single empty mug on the widow's stoop as an apology disguised as charity. The blacksmith left his hammer leaning against the fence in quiet solidarity. And even the telegraph operator tapped out messages not of business but of arrangements and memorials. In the midst of all this, a couple of boys gathered around Tom and asked questions in the halting way children ask when learning that the wide world contains both beauty and sorrow, and elders answered, some clumsy, some eloquent, but all with the new humility of those who realize bearing witness is work that cannot be outsourced. Plans were spoken. Names would be read aloud at the next Sunday service. A small plaque would be affixed to the square's flagpole. A proper marker would be set in Elias's grave so his identity would not sink into rumor. Talk of blame for the fire would come later, in kitchen whispers and courthouse corners. But for now the town's immediate labor was restoration of memory, not accusation. As the sun rose higher and the smell of smoke thinned into ordinary air, a quiet resolution took root among the group standing around the grave. Dry Creek would not let its newest lesson fade into convenience. They had watched a man give himself to a promise, and in response they would choose, deliberately, and with imperfect hands, to remember. Winter had passed like an old hymn, slow, measured, full of pauses that left the town of Dry Creek changed in the quiet ways that truly matter. And when spring came, it did not arrive with fanfare but with the soft insistence of rebirth. grass pushing through ash, children's laughter returning to the square, and the steady hammering of hands rebuilding the schoolhouse where loss had once burned its lesson into their bones. The air smelled of sawdust and forgiveness, of new paint and old stories being retold properly this time. Martha Calloway was there most mornings, watching from the edge of the square with her shawl pulled tight and her eyes bright with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had lived long enough to see grief turned into purpose. Sheriff Briggs, older somehow though only months had passed, stood beside the blacksmith to raise the new pole, a taller one, polished and sturdy, set into fresh earth with care that bordered on reverence. And when the time came to hoist the flag, the town gathered the way they had once gathered for funerals, only this time there was a steadiness, a shared understanding that this moment was not about death but continuation. The flag itself was unlike any other in the territory, stitched from the surviving remnants of the one Elias had carried through the storm and saved from the fire, its patches of cinched fabric lovingly reinforced by Martha's needle and thread, the seams imperfect yet honest, like the truth they had all learned too late. Across its face, the red seemed deeper, the blue steadier, the white no longer pure but wiser for its stains. It was not a symbol of perfection but of persistence, and that made it beautiful. The children had gathered wild flowers along the riverbank and placed them at the base of the pole, their colors trembling in the morning wind, and at their center stood a simple bronze plaque newly bolted into stone, its inscription glinting beneath the sun, in honor of Elias Crane, who fought not for glory, but for remembrance. The words had been chosen by Tom Miller, now a little taller, his handwriting still awkward but his heart certain, and Miss Langley had pressed the townsfolk to let the boy's phrasing stand as it was, unpolished and pure. The ceremony itself was brief. The preacher said only a few lines about courage, and Martha spoke a single sentence. He gave us back our memory before falling silent. When the rope was drawn and the flag began to climb, a hush fell that made even a wind seem respectful. The fabric caught the breeze at first hesitantly, as though testing whether it was welcome, then unfurled fully, glowing against the vast blue like a living thing. The town's breath rose with it, every head tilted upward, every face touched by the sun. And in that motion there was unity, not of nationalism or pride but of shared witness. For the first time, they saw the flag not as decoration for parades but as inheritance, the kind that required care. Sheriff Briggs removed his hat and placed it over his chest, and behind him the blacksmith began to hum a low, familiar tune that others soon joined, a song without words, the same melody Elias himself had once whistled when walking the dusty road into town. Martha closed her eyes, and in the hush between verses, a gust of wind swept through the square, strong enough to send the banner rippling high, snapping bright and free, as if the spirit of the man who had died for its meaning had chosen in that moment to rise with it. Tom smiled up at it through tears that glistened and did not fall, whispering something meant for no one but the sky. He sees it. And though no one answered aloud, the feeling that passed through the crowd was unanimous, that somewhere beyond the light, Elias Crane was standing again, tall and proud, his hand to his brow, watching the town he had taught to remember finally look upward with him. The wind carried the banner higher still, its patched seams fluttering like the heartbeat of a story retold, and for the first time in many years, Dry Creek's flag didn't just wave above the town, it waved for him. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.